Welcome to Darwin at the Movies. Though, in this second episode, there probably won't be too much Darwin. Instead, since, as discussed in the introduction video, I'm going to start off focusing on romantic comedy, I thought it might be useful to lay out some of the categories and themes in romantic comedy. Since I'm guessing most people aren't aware, there's a pretty well-developed scholarly literature on the romantic comedy. So, fleshing this out would help clarify some of the terms and concepts I'll be relying upon in future videos. Also, the non-Darwinian scholars who've studied these categories and themes usually attributed them to what biological realists might consider reasonable, though proximate, social, economic, and political circumstances or conditions. I'll mention those in my description, though of course in our Darwinian explanations in the videos to come in this series we'll be looking for the deeper, ultimate evolutionary and biological explanations. There are a variety of taxonomies of the romantic comedy, so here I'll only focus on what are widely viewed as the central phases in the history of romantic comedy. There are other, usually less well-defined phases stuck between these, and certainly not every romantic comedy made during a specific phase conforms to the definition of that phase. Overall, though, these descriptions do capture the prevailing trends. The first of these phases, usually considered to have begun with It Happened One Night, directed by Frank Capra, released in 1934, is called the screwball comedies. Arguably, the defining director of this phase was Howard Hawks, with such classics as 20th Century, Bringing Up Baby, and His Girl Friday, though honorable mention should go to George Cukor for Holiday, The Philadelphia Story, and Adam's Rib, among others. A prominent book written on these movies was called The Runaway Bride. This idea of the runaway bride captures one of the central themes in this phase of romantic comedy, which is the wrong partner. At least one of, and sometimes both, the protagonists, as part of their journey through the story, are escaping or need to escape marrying a wrong person. Sometimes, as in It Happened One Night, the family is expecting this marriage, and the premise of the story is escaping these familial obligations and fulfilling the protagonist's own interests by ending up with someone with whom he or she is in love. Another mainstay of this phase is the meet cute. This involves some unexpected, often amusing situation in which the protagonists meet, often getting things off to a rocky start. The battle over that last scene on the bus in It Happened One Night is an example. Also characteristic of these early screwballs was the role of play between the characters. In an era when explicit seduction was not going to get by the censors of the production code, playfulness among the characters served as a kind of surrogate foreplay. Sometimes it was physical play, though certainly the trading of wisecracks by this time was emerging as cinema's courtship rite. Female characters were portrayed as, for this era in film, usually strong-willed and socially strategic. Another peculiar fact is that a surprising number of the protagonists in these films worked as journalists. I'm not really sure why that is. Maybe we'll figure that out along our journey in discovering these films. Finally, such films were characterized by their reliable happy endings, in which the protagonists, often explicitly and pretty much always at least implicitly, wound up married to each other. Non-Darwinian scholars have attributed the rise of these movies to a new optimism in America with the beginning of the New Deal after years of depression. The screwball began to fade away with America's entry into World War II, though it never completely disappeared. At the other end of the war, though, and particularly with the disarming of the production code after Otto Preminger's successful challenge with his release of The Mood is Blue, a new kind of romantic comedy took prominence. Usually called sex comedies, sometimes seduction comedies, this phase is generally considered to have lasted from around 1953 to the mid-1960s. Among the defining directors of this phase were Michael Gordon, who did Pillow Talk, Boys' Night Out, and Move Over Darling, Delbert Mann, who did Lover Come Back, That Touch of Mink, and Billy Wilder with The 7-Year Itch, Some Like It Hot, and The Apartment. The sex comedies had themselves, in fact, two distinct periods built into them, and these were largely symbolized by two iconic leading ladies. In both, sexual seduction was at stake. In the earlier films, it was often Marilyn Monroe's adventurous gold digger who men had to be ready for. In the later films, Doris Day's proper career woman was fighting off the playboys until she found Mr. Right and marriage. Rock Hudson was her jousting partner in several of the classic sex comedies. Characteristic of this phase was that sex was treated as a commodity to be traded, and the women characters particularly were trading for security, either in the form of marriage or diamonds, which of course are a girl's best friend. A new feature of the romantic comedy, which was added by the sex comedies, is the best friend or sidekick character, which will later become a mainstay of the genre. Tony Randall was the archetypical sidekick in those Doris Day and Rock Hudson movies. The radical changes in the life between the sexes, brought about by the ready availability of birth control, the women's liberation movement, and Hugh Hefner's Playboy magazine bachelor ethos, are considered to have undermined the romantic assumptions underpinning the romantic comedies. Though romantic comedies continued to be made, such as Barefoot in the Park, The Graduate, and Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, no less than real-life romantic relationships, the genre struggled to figure out what exactly the new arrangements were to look like. All those conditions combined with the traumas to American life of the 1970s, particularly the Vietnam War and Watergate, occasioning a collapse in confidence in the society's institutions. And this may explain the rise of the next romantic comedy phase, the nervous romance. The defining director of the nervous romance phase was Woody Allen, and the genre is usually considered to have been inaugurated with his breakthrough hit, Annie Hall, in 1977. Indeed, the name for the genre was lifted from the Woody Allen promotion poster. Though Allen is the clear pioneer and definer of this phase, for instance with films like Annie Hall, Manhattan, Stardust Memories, and Hannah and Her Sisters, another influential director of this phase was James Brooks, with films like Broadcast News or As Good as It Gets. While in earlier romantic comedy there had been a variety of obstacles to the union of the protagonists, from family pressures to misunderstandings to conflicting intentions, in the nervous romance, the primary obstacle becomes the character's own neuroses. While in the romantic comedy of the earlier two phases, despite the obstacles, we were confident the couple would eventually wind up together, this is anything but a sure thing in the nervous romance. Indeed, it is the exception. Only Hannah and Her Sisters has the distinction of being an Allen film from this era, in which all the main characters end up happily married. More typical is Annie Hall's bittersweet reflection on lost love and the will to persist. Manhattan's final moment, in which Tracy, in ironic contrast to the behavior of the main characters during the movie, urges him to have a little faith in people, and the closing shot of husbands and wives, a close-up on Allen's character being interviewed by the presumptive filmmakers after conceding he was now out of the game, finally asking in the film's last words, "Are we done here? Can I go now?" Likewise, in Broadcast News, Holly Hunter taking us along the journey of trying to figure out which of the two male leads are to be her right and wrong partner, in the end winds up with neither of them. The nervous romance leaves us without any promise of romantic redemption. It is this latter promise that returns in the final of the four phases of the romantic comedy, often called the New Romance. Possibly attributable to a more conservative sexual ethos during the 1980s AIDS crisis, possibly riding on the upbeat air of the Reagan presidency and the end of the Cold War, the romantic comedy took a new turn. The directors most closely associated with the pioneering of the New Romance were the writer and director team who created, maybe not the first, but the iconic New Romance film, When Harry Met Sally, released in 1989. Directed by Rob Reiner, who would also direct The Princess Bride and The Sure Thing, and written by Nora Ephron, who would eventually both write and direct Sleepless in Seattle and You've Got Mail. When Harry Met Sally is the archetype of the new romance. It certainly isn't a return to the more carefree days of romantic comedy pre-nervous romances. The characters are still neurotic. However, in the new romances, love once again triumphs over character flaws and self-doubt. Indeed, it almost seems as though Reiner and Ephron set out to deliberately rewrite Annie Hall, and maybe even its close cousin Manhattan, with a happy ending. The promotional posters of Annie Hall and Harry and Sally are strikingly similar, the protagonist standing full frame, face to face. The opening credits used in When Harry Met Sally are those virtually trademarked by Woody Allen over his career. The soundtrack of Harry and Sally is full of the same classic tunes, especially Gershwin, that adorn Annie Hall and Manhattan. The characters are the epitome of Allen's quick-witted, self-absorbed New Yorkers, and as if Reiner and Ephron just couldn't resist, the film ends with a recreation of Allen's mad dash through the New York streets in Manhattan, once Billy Crystal's character, just as Woody Allen's had, suddenly realizes who he really loves. An interesting little bit of fun Reiner and Ephron have with the genre is that not only do they include both sidekicks and wrong partners for each of the protagonists, but the sidekicks and wrong partners are in fact the very same characters, which, if you were conscious of the history of the romantic comedy genre, was kind of funny. Since the onset of the 21st century, the internet and related technology have allowed for such effective leveraging of niche markets that we now live in a world where these different genres can easily coexist. Lost in Translation, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, and The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind are more recent examples of nervous romances, while new romances have continued to go strong in the likes of High Fidelity, Love Actually, About Time, and Definitely Maybe. Indeed, we've seen the occasional homage to the sex comedies, such as in Down with Love, with a small supporting role played by Tony Randall, no less. So this is the landscape of romantic comedy in the movies, in the present and in history. And since romantic comedy's core concern is the central focus of evolutionary fitness, the success or not of mating efforts, it shouldn't be surprising that looking at these films through a Darwinian lens should provide some interesting insights. And if, as I proposed in the introduction to this series, such films can be regarded as fossils of the evolved human mind, those Darwinian insights should also tell us something about the human experience and our world, recently past and present. So, in episode 3, we'll finally get down to business. And I'll look forward to seeing you then, when next we take Darwin to the movies.